everyone! Thanks for joining my talk today about onboarding engineers onto your team. I'm excited that I get to talk about this with you today because even with the world being what it is right now, people are still starting new jobs, and a lot of those people are starting them remotely when that wasn't necessarily what their teams were expecting. It's not always easy to translate an in-person onboarding process into a remote one, or even easy to come up with one from scratch at all. But onboarding is such an important part of bringing on a new team member. So I wanted to tell you today about how we've built ours at Fellow and give you tips on how you can create your own too. I'm Alexandra Sunderland, and I've been working as an engineer for almost the last decade. And right now I'm an engineering manager at Fellow, which is based in Ottawa, Canada. I've spent a lot of time putting together onboarding processes and helping engineers get set up on new teams throughout my career. I created the onboarding process at Fellow, and before that, I was at SurveyMonkey, where I was a coordinator for the internship program, where I built processes to onboard students and things like that. I've also been working in a kind of hybrid remote setup for the last 4 years. My first day of actually being full-time in the office was supposed to be a week after the whole city transitioned to work from home back in March. So I didn't get to do that, which is too bad, but I do have all this experience now of working remote and in this hybrid setup and in person as well. So it's definitely helped me with setting up a lot of these processes to be inclusive of different situations. Onboarding is crucial to a team's long-term success because it sets the stage for your team and demonstrates what the real values are. If you don't focus on actively showing things like clear communication and onboarding, which is very important, it's a lot less likely that after getting caught up, everyone will start communicating really efficiently. Creating a good process really makes sure that people feel like they have psychological safety, and it goes a long way towards being able to quickly scale up a team where everyone can trust each other and be vulnerable and feel okay asking for help and learning. I've always had a particular empathy for people starting a new job, and I think that's because of how absolutely lost I felt when I started my first programming job. When I was really young, I was very lucky and I got an internship over the summer before starting university at a local startup. And I was pretty much only knew Visual Basic and a little bit of Java, so the stuff they teach you in school. And I had never heard of web programming, so didn't know that you could even have web apps as a business because this was a while ago. And so, long story short, I spent weeks schooling things like what is an API and what is a webhook, what is a request, what is a server, how do you log into a server, and just going further and further down this rabbit hole because I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know who I was supposed to ask, and I felt like it was assumed that I was supposed to have all the answers. Because there was no onboarding process that I got to go through, I felt a little bit lost, and that's always stuck with me. It was also a great learning experience, though. I think I probably learned the most that summer out of any of them, but this is not a scalable experience when you're building a team. Since then, I've helped onboard a lot of people in a lot of different ways, and I've also screwed up in the process a lot. The first time I onboarded someone, I walked them through the entire code base, which was thousands and thousands of lines. And I explained every single little bit of code to them without giving any context onto what the application did, who it was built for, why it was built. And that was awful because they had no idea how to go about answering their own questions. And there was no way for them to remember everything that I said. I also taught a class for a specific technology at my last job to all the new incoming engineers, but only a handful of them ever even needed to use that, and so it ended up being a very boring waste of time for everyone. I've also assumed that people know way more about the organization than they do, and I've accidentally had someone believe for a whole week that I was their manager when I was not. I made a lot of mistakes, but that also means that I learned a lot and adapted the process to be even better every single time. It's very important to go into onboarding assuming that the person has the skills and the abilities to perform the job they're hired to do, but does not have any of the context yet. Eventually, after making a lot more mistakes with a lot more people, I narrowed down a framework for onboarding that we're now using at Fellow and about half the company has been through. We've shaped the process together over time as we've collected lots of feedback, and this is the framework that I want to share with you today so that you can also create your own onboarding process and get engineers up to speed on your team quickly and effectively. Before we get started though, it's important to frame everything you do and every process that you set up through the eyes of the new hire. Think back to when you first started and all the questions you had and the difficulties you encountered, and remember that when they start, they likely won't know any of the internal processes or traditions, and they're going to be feeling a little bit out of place while they try to get up to speed. It's important to focus the whole process building around empathy towards people. And right now, it's especially important to have an even deeper sense of empathy, because whether or not they were hired to work remotely, the current situation is not normal remote work. If they were hired expecting to come into an office, they might not have a proper office space set up at home, or they might not have fast internet, or they might have to be looking after kids or parents, or just might not overall have the ideal work from home setup. So whatever their situation is, it's important to be patient and understanding and to reassure them that you're there for them and that you also understand that this is not going to be a normal work environment for a while. So step 1, focus on relationships. The most important part of onboarding is setting up the right relationships early on. By making those connections early, it'll be easier for the person to start talking with others and to ask any questions to get up to speed faster. It can be kind of awkward coming in somewhere and not knowing who's in charge of what, or like who to ask certain things from, or not knowing if people even realize that you exist. Some of the most important interactions that you can start setting up are one-on-ones. So making sure that you get your first one-on-one with your new direct report early on and keep it going on a regular cycle so that they know they have a time and a space to talk to you about things like career goals and ideas. And it's a great time for you to get a good pulse check on how they're doing and talk about things that they might not want to bring up in team meetings. Introducing them to team members is important, but also sometimes forgotten. So make sure that your team knows in advance that someone is joining and let them know to welcome them when they get there. And most importantly, set them up with a buddy. It'll be easier for them to ask questions if they know they have a dedicated person to go to who is expecting to get a lot of questions. And when you're working remotely, this relationship step is especially important and has to be done in a very deliberate way, since the chance of a hallway talk is a lot lower and difficult for people who aren't really used to it. I like to use a Slack message or an email to have the new hire introduce themselves to the team or the company if you're not quite that large yet. Slack is a little bit better, I find, because everyone can interact with the message and add happy emojis and like ta-da and be very happy and start a thread and really collaborate and engage with the new hire. Setting them up with a buddy here, though, is very important because when you can't visibly see whether or not someone is getting annoyed with your questions, you're going to be a lot less likely to ask them. And this is a point in time where it's critical to ask as many questions as possible. So if they're set up with a dedicated question answer, they're not going to feel as bad about asking their questions. Instead of sending emails to intro them to the people they'll be working with, though, set up individual video calls so that they can get a feel for how the person communicates. Getting an indication for things like sarcasm level in speech can be very important information and avoid some mix-ups if you're only talking over Slack. Don't schedule them all back to back though, because video call fatigue is very real, especially now. And if your new hire is an introvert or maybe not as comfortable on video, this is going to be a very exhausting step in the process during a already stressful time. Step 2, write knowledge down. There is a lot of knowledge that your team has, which is just like known stuff that any other outsider would not be able to figure out for themselves without asking. Every team has this, and it creates a bit of a bottleneck. So you should figure out what that information is and write it down. For example, if there's ever any issue that someone on the team encounters and someone says, "Oh yeah, that happened to me last week. I did X to solve it," you should write that down. Or if there's an announcement at a team meeting about a new way of doing things or a new linter to install or anything like that, you should write that down too. And this doesn't have to look like the type of documentation that you'd expect for a API or a third-party library, but it should cover the things that are super specific to your team. And it won't just help out new hires, it'll also pay off for the people within the team too. I've gone to look back at our dev docs plenty of times to remember how to run particular tests or set up an environment just right. This should be a very collaborative effort from everyone on the team and be a living document that's changing almost every day. And you can set up this knowledge base in any online collaboration tool. So we host internal docs on a site built on the Read the Docs Sphinx theme because it's nice and familiar to us as a mostly Python dev team. But I've also seen that GitLab does this by hosting their docs on their own platform, which is also kind of cool. And I'll show a bit of that later. Step 3, create a FAQ. Similar to your codebase's documentation, you should create a team and company frequently asked questions document. There are a lot of non-code things that are just known as well within the team too, like how to properly create a pull request or how to request time off or what the Jira process is, like how to hand off tickets to QA, where the Wi-Fi info is stored, or even just like what meeting etiquette is and whether you need to prep anything or not. There is a lot, and it can all be figured out just by living on the team for a while, but it'll reduce stress by having answers to some of those questions up front. This is also something that everyone on your team should contribute to and should be something that new hires add questions to while they're discovering that they wish they knew something. Step 4, set goals and milestones. One of the biggest stress-inducing parts of joining a new team is not knowing what you're expected to accomplish and by when. It's pretty common to see people going overboard, trying to do as much as they possibly can in the shortest amount of time, or like working overtime in the first few months while pretending that they aren't just to make it seem like they have it all together. It can really feel like you're supposed to be as good as the existing team members when you join, and that's impossible to achieve because you aren't used to the code base yet and you don't have all this institutional knowledge, and they've potentially been working there for years. To avoid that, you should set out a realistic timeline for different goals for them to accomplish. For example, break down the dev setup process into small chunks, which might span a day or whatever, and then set out a goal for completing a particular ticket or creating a pull request and whatever like little units of work that you can do in 1 week on your team. These should be very easily doable so that the new hire feels like they're on track when they check each item off. And then set up goals for them to track their progress throughout the next 3 months. So they should have a clear understanding of what knowledge they're expected to have, what pace they should be working at, and they should figure out like where they should be by that point. And by defining exactly what you're looking for, they're not going to burn themselves out and they'll know how to plan out their work so they can meet the goals. And it gives them something to work towards. And if they surpass expectations, then they'll be able to be proud of themselves, and that also in turn like boosts their productivity. When you're remote, you should celebrate the goals and milestones that they achieve on a team Slack channel, because it's not very easy for them to swivel their chair around and happily announce to everyone that they've created their first pull request. So you should look out for those moments and call them out on Slack so that the team can celebrate with them. Even when I was in the office in person, one of the ways I felt extremely welcome to the team was when my manager commented on my first pull request saying that I did a great job and congrats. Step number 5, set up their physical space. This might seem obvious, but it's actually sometimes forgotten. So make sure that you have a computer and any required hardware for people well in advance of their anticipated start date. I've seen, when we were in person, I've seen people like scramble to clear off the storage desk so that someone has somewhere to sit on their first day. When people are working remotely though, you'll have to take this a step further and figure out how to get hardware to the person's home. People who are working from home right now might not have been expecting to be working that way, and their homes might not be set up with a proper office space. So you should try to figure out as well whether your company can allocate a budget to outfit their home office, or even if there's any equipment that can be loaned from any in-person office. Having a desk, a chair, and a monitor can make a big difference compared to sitting on the couch looking down at a laptop for a few weeks, and it'll make them feel a lot more productive too. I did this back in university for a few months, sat on the couch with my laptop, and I had to get physio to fix my back because I was crouched over so much. It's also good though to make sure that they have fast unlimited internet. Otherwise, doing things like having video calls or installing software might cause a little bit of worry for them. Step 6, ask for feedback. Asking for feedback is something that doesn't come naturally, especially if it's about you or something that you've made and you're proud of. But it's a crucial step in the process because if you don't, you'll be missing out on key insights about things that aren't working. I have a feedback survey that I send out to every new engineer after their first week on the team, which I send within Fellow. And I ask them some star rating questions so I can track metrics over time, but also a lot of open-ended questions about what worked really well and what did not. And I also ask for ideas about what they would do to make their first week even easier if they could go over it again. It's played a big part in how we've shaped the process, and every piece of feedback we get makes it even easier for the next person joining the team. We also make it easy for people to contribute their feedback directly into the process. So the FAQs and the team documentation are editable by anyone, and they're encouraged to correct anything that's no longer valid and make pull requests to make sure that we're keeping all of our information up to date. And these little contributions help them feel more a part of the team too. So that's a lot of stuff, a lot of steps. And it might be a little bit hard to visualize some of that as an actual process. So I'm going to show you how we've put this together at Fellow. This is an example template of a note that we use for people joining the team. It gets attached to the all-day event marking their first day on the calendar, and it's divided up into different sections that cover each of the steps. The resources section includes links to documentation and handbooks, which will have most of the answers that people need, a lot of those FAQs. And the three sections at the bottom contain a bunch of action items with things like setup process for the first day and a bunch of goals for them to achieve over the next week. Outside of this, though, we also set up a bunch of team meetings like lunches and sales demos and get-togethers and coffee chats and things like that, just to create a little bit more of a social environment. GitLab also has a very similar set of templates, which I think are a great starting point. And these guide people through their first few days, helps them getting set up with accounts and lets people know what's to come and what's expected of them. So this is a screenshot of just part of one. GitLab's entire company handbook is available online for free, including all of the remote onboarding templates. And if you search for GitLab remote onboarding, online, it'll come up, and this is a great resource to base your process off of. So with these 6 steps as a baseline, relationships, knowledge, FAQ, goals, space, and feedback, you'll have a great foundation to create a repeatable onboarding process for your team. These are really the bare bones that you need in order to level the playing field and make sure that everyone joining gets an equal footing in their first few weeks. You never want to leave this all to chance and just hope that the person ends up befriending someone who walks them through everything or is extroverted enough to figure things out for themselves. And while some of those steps might seem like things to tackle later on when you have your next hire, there are some things that you can start doing today to get ready for then. No matter what your role is on the team, you can start by creating a set of documentation for your code base with things like obscure knowledge that you just happen to know, like how to set up the testing environment of the building system, or who has the right auth tokens to re-record API test cassettes. You can also create a team FAQ for those non-code things, like which meetings are actually meetings and what you don't have to go to. We have a weekly Friday meeting, which we just book in our calendars so we can take notes for it, but we don't actually physically meet. It's asynchronous. That confused new hires for a long time until we wrote that down. And lastly, you can ask your team for feedback. Even if you don't have any kind of official process, everyone on your team started at some point, and they probably have some thoughts on what could have made it easier. So you should ask them or send out a survey and use that as a base point to figure out what changes you can start making right away. This process will take some time to build up from scratch, and you probably want to start basic before ramping up to anything too complex. Eventually, you can start experimenting with things like classes or official meet and greet sessions and things like that. But also remember that there is such a thing as too much process. If you have a company with 10 people, you probably don't need to start with a week-long process with classes and instructors and a ton of structure. And you should start small and build up as needed because you still want to give people some flexibility in how they start their new job. I hope that I've given you some ideas on how you can create your own first onboarding program or change up what you have now to make it even more remote friendly. I'd love to hear about any unique ways you're onboarding people, or if you have any success with what I've talked about today. You can get in touch with me through my Twitter handle, AlexandraS_dev, or through my website listed there. Thank you.